Use 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Good morning and welcome to Sunday with Michael Portillo. With the clocks set back, join me on this autumnal morning as we stroll, protected from the falling leaves by a canopy of arts, culture, good debate and conversation. To politics first. Has the devastating conflict in the Middle East affected the fortunes of Sir Keir Starmer? The Labour leader is facing his most concerted internal challenge yet over his response to the war between Israel and Hamas, and is now facing serious pressure to call for a ceasefire. Separately, as another Member of Parliament is accused of sexual misconduct, would it be right for MPs who face such allegations automatically to be banned from the parliamentary estate? I'll discuss those matters with a panel of canny observers. In Ukraine, the Russians are accused of committing war crimes and on the highly specific charge of abduction of children. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. A new documentary, Ukraine's Stolen Children, examines the alleged crimes. I'll be joined by a dedicated filmmaker who tracked down parents and children forcibly separated by the Russian government. Revelations by Lord Heseltine have reignited a bitter dispute from half a century ago about the mutilation of some of England's historic counties. In 1972, as a junior minister in Edward Heath's government, Heseltine redrew centuries-old boundaries by flying over the country in a light aircraft with a pencil and a map. The admission has provoked outrage. I'll be speaking to Henry Smith, MP. Someone who could never be accused of cultural vandalism is our resident theatre critic, Stefan Kyriazis, who will join me with a tribute to the late theatre producer and Everton Football Club chairman, Bill Kenwright. All of that to come, but first, your latest headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Michael, thank you very much and good morning. Good morning, 2 minutes past 11. There are reports this morning of residents in Gaza breaking into aid centres and warehouses in a desperate search for vital supplies. The United Nations described it as a worrying sign that civil order is starting to fade, with the ongoing conflict giving way to a humanitarian catastrophe. Despite assurances from Israel that aid trucks will be allowed into Gaza, the UN says supplies crossing the border from Egypt are insufficient. Last night, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the second stage of its war with Hamas has begun and warned of a long and difficult campaign ahead. A group of Israeli activists have held an anti-war demonstration in Tel Aviv. Protesters blocked a road near the Ministry of Defence, holding up banners claiming war has no winners. They also called for a ceasefire and the return of hostages. Prime Minister Netanyahu met some families of hostages yesterday, reassuring them their release is part of the country's military goals in Gaza. The Hollywood actor Matthew Perry, star of the legendary sitcom Friends, has died at the age of 54.
Forget hypnosis. The way to quit smoking is you have to dance naked in a field of heather and then bathe in the sweat of 6 healthy young men.
Or what my father calls Thursday night.
Police were called to his home in Los Angeles, where he was found unresponsive in a hot tub. He became a household name as the dry and witty Chandler Bing, alongside Jennifer Aniston, Lisa Kudrow and others. The enormous success of Friends made it an icon of 90s popular culture. It ran for 10 seasons, with the final episode becoming the 5th most watched finale in TV history. Warner Brothers said in a statement that his comedic genius was felt around the world and his legacy will live on in the hearts of many. Showbiz expert Kinsey Schofield spoke to GB News about the sad news.
This is a man who we have seen working on his body and challenging his body over the last few weeks. One of the last paparazzi photos taken of Matthew was on October 3rd as he exited a gym. So I know that there is speculation in regards to his past and, you know, could some of those demons have come back to haunt him when it comes to addiction? But he, over the last year or so, I'd say 2 years now, was very proud of his sobriety, promoted his sobriety, and was focused on being better physically and mentally.
Police are being encouraged to double their use of facial recognition software to track down offenders over the next 6 months. Policing Minister Chris Philp says the technology could be used to scan more than 200,000 images, matching them against the police database. He's also encouraging police to expand the use of live facial recognition so offenders might be identified on the spot. Mr Philp says it'll allow police to stay one step ahead of criminals and make Britain's streets safer. Meanwhile, the number of police who've been sacked for misconduct is up by 70%, with around 100 losing their jobs in the last 12 months. Met Police Commissioner Samart Rowley says the number is likely to increase as the force cracks down on those who are unfit to serve. Now, a US tech entrepreneur says the NHS's backlog can't be solved without technological innovation. Alex Karps, the chief executive and co-founder of Plantir, which is bidding to win a contract to provide AI software to the health service. He says the use of AI in healthcare would speed up systems and improve life expectancy. It comes as NHS waiting lists are predicted to top 8 million by next summer. Scotland's refugees minister is asking the UK government for urgent funding to help communities house migrants. Emma Roddick supports the government's plan to cut the use of hotels for asylum seekers and says tackling the backlog in asylum cases should be a priority. But she warns that shifting the financial burden onto local authorities would be unacceptable and reckless. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick said this week that the number of hotels used to house migrants will be cut by 50 over the next 3 months. And finally, in sport, heavyweight champion Tyson Fury recovered from being knocked down to win a controversial split decision over boxing newcomer Francis Ngannou. 37-year-old MMA fighter Ngannou put Fury on the canvas in just the 3rd round after connecting with a left hook. But while one judge scored it 95-94 in favour of Ngannou, 2 of the judges gave it to Fury. Fury's victory means a bout with fellow heavyweight champion Alexander Usyk remains on the line. You're with GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on your digital radio, and now on your smart speaker by simply saying play GB News. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you, Tatiana Sanchez. Sir Keir Starmer knew that his response to the outbreak of war between Israel and Hamas would have to clearly acknowledge that Israel had suffered an appalling terrorist attack and had the right to defend itself in order to distinguish the party that he leads from the Labour Party of Jeremy Corbyn, which was found guilty of anti-Semitism. In his defence of Israel, Starmer appeared even to condone cutting off water and electricity supplies to Gaza. The remarks made in a radio interview have prompted a furious response by some in his party. Several councillors have resigned. Shabana Mahmood, the Shadow Justice Secretary, has broken ranks by accusing Israel of inflicting collective punishment on Palestinians, and 10 members of the Shadow team are on resignation watch. On the other side of the aisle, another Conservative MP faces serious allegations. Crispin Blunt has been arrested on an allegation of rape, but says he expects no charges to result. It's reignited the debate on whether MPs in such a position should be banned from the parliamentary estate. To discuss all of that, I have an excellent political panel. Sam Ashworth-Hayes from The Telegraph, Matthew Lazar, former advisor of the Labour Party, and Joseph Dinich, who is Deputy Editor of CAPEX. Matthew, let's begin with you. What do you make of what's going on within the Labour Party and within the Shadow team? How serious is this for Keir Starmer?
I think it's pretty serious, Michael. This is probably the biggest crisis that Keir's faced in his leadership because it's a sort of visceral issue for many people in the party, but sort of two factions within the party. One is what you might call the sort of peace faction, the sort of traditional left, and the second is obviously for the Muslim community who feel particularly strongly about what's going on in Gaza and the unfairness as they perceive it of the treatment between Israel and Gaza by Keir and by the senior team. So it is serious, and we'll see how it plays out over the next couple of days. I think today's news that certain supplies are being restored and that there's a bit more of a focus on aid in the south of Gaza will help. But I can tell you that Sir Keir's waking up every morning wish he hadn't misspoken, to use that phrase, because the LBC interview was a bit of a mess and he sort of got himself literally tongue-tied. And so that gave a chink that people have exploited to go beyond just criticising him for appearing to condone the water and electricity being switched off into calling for a ceasefire, which is, in my view, a mistake.
What do you make of the electoral calculations? There was some talk that Labour would be in danger of losing seats because of seats that have a high Muslim vote. But I was thinking that in England, anyway, that seems pretty improbable. Those seats are unlikely to go to the Conservatives. I doubt whether they go to the Liberal Democrats. I guess in Scotland, more of an issue. There are seats there where the SNP's position would be seen to be less pro-Israeli anyway than the Labour Party's position. Is that part of the fear?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm old enough to remember during the Iraq War what happened, and you had seats with large Muslim populations which literally just switched to the Liberal Democrats overnight. Now in those seats, the Liberal Democrats get 1 or 2%. And of course, when Charles Kennedy was leading the Liberal Democrats, his one big policy was opposition to the Iraq War, which won Muslim support. We haven't heard from the Lib Dems at the moment, and it's interesting to see if we do anything that would give, which would give effectively disgruntled voters on the centre-left who are angry about Keir's position on Israel and Hamas somewhere to go. So, as you say, only in Scotland is there somewhere obvious for them to go. But people do worry, but the thing that the public don't sort of think about very much, but politicians certainly do, which is the internal electorate, the selectorate within the parties. And obviously, in Muslim-majority areas, the Labour Party will be heavily dominated by Muslim members. Add in the left of all ethnicities, and therefore people worry about their own position. I mean, what's interesting is two of the people on not in the shadow cabinet, but in the junior front bench who are on the resignation watch are the two MPs for Luton, which is a heavily Muslim town, and the Labour Party will be very, very closely entwined with the Muslim community. Neither of them are of Muslim heritage themselves. They're both on diametrically opposite ends of the party. One's, a sort of Starmerite at heart, and one's a sort of traditional lefty Corbynite. But they're both allegedly threatening to resign because they're worried about pressure, both from their voters but also from their members.
Sam, writing for a right-of-centre newspaper, have you been quite impressed by Sir Keir Starmer. I mean, I've been surprised by the extent to which he's come out and defended, well, first of all, of course, stated that this is a terrorist atrocity, but secondly, very much asserted Israel's right to self-defence. Has the tone of that surprised you?
It's been in keeping with what I've sort of seen from Starmer generally over the last couple of years, which is that he's set out specifically to rehabilitate Labour and to make it very clear this is no longer the party of Jeremy Corbyn. So he came out last year very strongly in favour of NATO, in favour of Ukraine, its right to defend itself. He tried to draw a line under sort of doubt over where Labour stood in foreign policy and on defence. And he's done a great deal of work, obviously, to rehabilitate its image over anti-Semitism as well. And now this will be extremely unwelcome because it sort of casts all of that work into... Well, it shows how much further there is to go, basically. You have large chunks of his party who are sort of falling into this traditional...
Is it necessarily extremely unwelcome if people like you and people like me are quite impressed by Starmer's performance, and after all, the votes he's after are the ones that he didn't get last time rather than the ones he did get last time? Is it necessarily all downside, this?
I think the problem is that you risk certain voters peeling off, and perhaps the number of voters who are willing to switch Conservative to Labour and who sort of feel unable to do so by the fact that Labour takes a better stance on defence on foreign affairs might be somewhat offset by the voters who would then lose on the left of the party. But also that there is still the reminder that actually there is still a large faction within the Labour Party which is not perhaps well aligned with what we'd want for the country and what we'd want for our foreign policy. And how secure Keir Starmer is over the next couple of years then still comes into some doubt again.
Joseph, how have you viewed this? I mean, first of all, how do you think Keir has done in the years that he's been leader? Do you agree that this is his biggest ever crisis, at least internally? And how do you think he's acquitting himself?
So I think it's certainly it's a pretty big internal crisis. I don't think that's up for argument, really. And I suppose from Keir Starmer's perspective, it's a real shame because in recent weeks, he seems to have done quite well. Sort of, he's built up a lot of positive momentum since his conference speech, where we sort of finally got a sense of what Starmerism might mean and what policy direction that might take. He's also, as Sam said, he's made good efforts to rehabilitate his party of its sort of lunatic fringe elements. And at a moment like this, with the general election looming, the last thing Keir Starmer wants is for his party to look like a disunited front. You know, we have an electorate which has been battered by economic mismanagement, political instability caused by Tory infighting. And I think that the prospect of another government, which again is going to be split on these big issues, is pretty unacceptable.
I'm going to push back on this a bit as well, because, I mean, I think people understand that what we used to call the Arab-Israeli question is a kind of particular thing. And, it doesn't dominate British politics. It's very important just at the moment. And let me put the argument to you as well, that, an ally like the United States might be doubting what the Labour Party is going to look like in office. Well, here is Keir Starmer giving a pretty good display. Firstly, that he's going to align with, Western policy. And secondly, that he's actually got a bit of guts. He is taking enormous risks in this. Again, I put it to you, is this all downside for Starmer?
So, on that front, I think you're right. He's shown some real gumption. He's shown some guts. He's going to stick to his guns on Israel. And I think for Starmer to now row back on his commitment to Israel's right to protect itself, it carries, as you say, pretty big international risks for his reputation. It's important to remember that the conflict between Israel and Hamas is still at a point where Hamas is holding 200 hostages, and 5 of which are British. And I think, particularly sort of domestically as well, if Starmer was to soften his position too much now, it would look as though he was cowing to these elements in his party.
Well, he probably is going to have to be pretty tough over a long period of time, because this is going to be a lengthy campaign. Do you mind if I turn to something else, Matthew?
Not at all.
This question that, if somebody has been... Well, in the case of Crispin Blunt, the name is out there in public. He's been arrested but not charged. He has been suspended. But he is allowed access to the palace. His had the whip taken away on the Conservative Party, but he's allowed access to the palace. I mean, should we say that if somebody has been accused of something, I suppose in particular a sexual crime, that they should not be allowed into the Palace of Westminster anymore?
I think it's a very, very difficult question because this isn't an ordinary job. So the rule, because you're not just there to, turn up and do a job, you're not, stamping pieces of paper or making something. You're actually voting on behalf of your entire constituency, both those who voted for you and those who didn't vote for you. You're representing people. So I think it's very hard to ban people before they're charged from appearing on the parliamentary estate, unless you get to the stage where somebody... We saw it, we've seen it in one or two examples where it's been allowed when people have been on maternity leave, where they've had a proxy. I think Stella Creasy had somebody sort of acting, an existing MP acting, maybe a new person, I think, did some of the constituency work, but unless you put in place an alternative scheme, you're effectively disenfranchising people with what are, in this case and in others, allegations. Once somebody's been charged, and certainly, obviously, once somebody's been convicted and we're waiting for the parliamentary, the recall petition, etc., to kick in, I think that's a different story. But I think it worries me about disenfranchising people.
Sam, Matthew is making there a rather practical point about continuing the business of constituents. But what about the point of natural justice here?
Well, yes, I think that's true as well, until you have been proven to have done something wrong. And to be honest, perhaps in this particular case, given the role of an MP and the role they play within our Constitution, proven guilty in the course of law, I would be deeply uncomfortable with saying these people cannot fulfil their roles, their duty to their constituents and to vote in Parliament. Now, that doesn't mean you can't take sort of measures to make sure that people around them are safe. It doesn't mean you can't sort of expedite investigations where possible, but you should not be, on the basis of allegation alone, depriving people of their representative.
On the point of natural justice, again to you, Joseph, I mean, Matthew let slip a moment ago, well, maybe when they're charged, but I would say, well, even if they have been charged, they haven't yet been found guilty. And some of these processes take so long. Are we really to say that someone who has faced an allegation cannot be allowed onto the parliamentary estate?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because, so firstly, I've never worked in Parliament, but from what I understand, it is not an ordinary workplace. These are powerful people with very important responsibilities to fulfil. That being said, sexual misconduct and allegations thereof are incredibly important, must be taken very seriously. And in any other workplace, particularly sort of in the 21st century, if an employee has had an allegation brought against them for an action which made a colleague feel violated in some way, general practice is that they are put on leave until the allegation has been dealt with and investigated. And in Parliament, that's a very tricky thing to do because MPs have to represent their constituency interests in Parliament. So I think perhaps the establishment of a sort of independent HR process to deal with these things within Parliament would be a good first step.
Because good Lord, the last thing we want, I think, is another HR process. Matthew, I think I'm simply going to take a vote. I'm going to take a vote. So the proposition is, if someone has been charged with a sexual offence, a member of Parliament, do you think that they should be suspended from the parliamentary estate? Yes or no? No. No. No.
No.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think so.
I thought we were going to say yes. Yeah. Following your words, I thought we were going to say yes, but I think we're out of time. But anyway, thank you. So, in the end, it was a unanimous vote. My vote is no as well, by the way. Thank you very much to Sam Ashworth-Hayes, Joseph Dinage and Matthew Lazar. After the break, the makers of a new documentary, Ukraine's Stolen Children, will join me in the studio to discuss the crime for which a warrant has been issued for the arrest of Vladimir Putin. Stay with us.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie, second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m. Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back. It is alleged that many war crimes have been committed in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Only one has so far led the International Criminal Court to issue an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin, and that is the accusation that Ukrainian children were seized and deported to Russia. A warrant is out also for Maria Lvova-Belova, the Presidential Commissioner for Children's Rights in Russia. She's overseen the removal of children from their families in occupied Ukraine and their placement in Russian foster homes. In a new film, Ukraine's Stolen Children, currently showing on ITV, my next guest was able to interview Lvova-Belova and gain unprecedented access to parents and children who were kept apart for months by the Russians. Shahida Tulaganova directed and produced the film. First, let's hear some of the testimony that she has collected.
То, что они укрыли от бомбежек, эти бомбежки были же из-за них. То есть они выгнали ЗСУ из города, то есть они сами туда заехали, и все, и как бы типа нас спасают. Но я считаю, это бред полнейший.
Австрия отказала Стахов, так что мы здесь будем находиться на горах. Потому что Российская Федерация ушла с Херсона, и туда опасно возвращать детей украинским солдатам.
Я пыталась разговаривать даже с администрацией с лагеря, где находился Даня, но как только слышали вопрос касаемо ребенка, просто трубка ложилась, либо номер потом был недоступен. Я была просто морально очень сильно подавлена. Я виновата была в том, что я его все-таки, что надо было все-таки настоять на своем и не отпускать.
Что нас запугивали там в России. Нас там мозги заговаривали так, чтобы мы не ехали, чтобы мы были против Украины. И типа все просто, вот все дети, короче, просто велись на это. Мне, получается, сказали, что я могу получить квартиру, когда мне исполнится 18, я могу получить квартиру в Краснодаре. Учу еще, буду получать 30 тысяч рублей, типа, могу нормально жить. Типа, а тут в Украине я приеду, ничего не получу.
The maker of that film, Shahida, is with me now. Welcome to GB News. Congratulations on this extraordinary documentary series. I say that as a documentary maker. It is remarkable. Do you think you found evidence of a war crime?
Well, it's up to the lawyers and to the court to decide whether there's a war crimes or not. My job as a journalist to document and find the stories. But judging from the amount of children who were taken to Russia, the whole orphanages were taken to Russia from Kherson region, for example, I think this is an unprecedented amount of children to be deported to Russian Federation. So that could be a war crime, or could be not.
And you've made some pretty edgy documentaries during your career, and sometimes the footage that you have and the interviews that you've taken have been called upon as evidence in war crimes trials. Is that correct?
That's right. I made a film about the genocide of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and I interviewed the General Kim Il-sung, who actually was the mastermind behind the whole idea of extermination of Rohingya people. And the lawyers who represented the Rohingya case in International Court of Justice requested this interview because that was the only interview he actually ever gave to the foreign journalist.
The documentary reveals that the movement of the children is not, as it were, always a one-way process. Some have gone to Russia, but then have come back. So what is the situation? Are they obliged to stay in Russia? Is it difficult to get them back?
It's extremely hard to get them back. There were a lot of children, about 4,000 children, who were taken from Ukraine, from Kherson, to occupied Crimea in the pretext of going on holiday camps. And they were stuck there because the front line has changed. By the time they were supposed to come back, Ukraine liberated a certain part of Kherson, and children were not able to come back. And it was extremely difficult for their parents to move all the journey from Ukraine via Poland, via Belarus to Russia, and then to occupied Crimea to collect them for many different reasons.
Yes.
Number one. Number two, women who go back to claim their children, they face interrogation, which can take hours by the Russian troops. And then they have to present all the documents confirming that they're moms. This is the children who have parents. But the big chunk of children who are taken, they're orphans.
Yes.
They could be social orphans or could be real orphans. And the policy of returning these children is totally unknown at the moment. When I spoke to Putin's children's rights representative, Maria Lvova-Belova, she actually made it clear that perhaps orphans will not be returned. So there's a big question mark about the fate of these children.
I was amazed that you got this interview with Lvova-Belova. She is someone who has had an arrest warrant issued against her by the International Criminal Court. Why did she give you the interview, do you think?
I think it took a long month, 5 months of waiting and calling and etc. I think at this stage, Russia wants to portray themselves as saviors of the children, somebody who's doing a good job. And I think that's the only reason she agreed to talk to me, because after she spoke to me, she had a big press conference with the foreign press where she exactly explained what they're trying to do and say that we are only for family reunification. We're doing everything possible for children to go back home. However, in an interview, she acknowledged that the process of returning the child back home takes at least 3 months.
Yeah. So she's had an arrest warrant issued against her. Do you think that she was surprised by that, outraged by that? Is she worried about it? Do they care about the ICC?
I think the ICC arrest warrant took them by surprise. Because genuinely Russian television was showing them like we're taking children to safety zone from the armed violence. She believes that this is ridiculous. It's a quote that the arrest warrant was issued because from her point of view, she's saving children. Whether they care, they do. Even though Russians pretend that they do not, they simply do. That's why she spoke to me. That's why she had another press conference after that for the international press to explain her position. She does care. Is she worried? I'm not so sure.
Yeah. We saw one girl there being interviewed who was saying, you know, it was preposterous of the Russians to claim to be their saviors since they'd invaded their country in the first place and bombed them. What did you get the impression that children had been swayed by Russian propaganda when they'd lived in Russia? And did you get the impression that many of them had been traumatized?
All of them are traumatized because they've been apart from their parents for at least 6 months, living with people they don't know in a conditions where sometimes quite bad. And the worst thing for them was not knowing when are they going to go home. And for the child, it's very traumatic. They've been brainwashed. And there was a boy called Kostya, who's 14, whose totally mind was twisted. He didn't want to go back when his sister came for him. Finally, he didn't want to go back because he thought that he's going to be killed in Ukraine. Because they said, you came to Russia now, you're going to be treated as traitor in Ukraine. And he was genuinely scared. We have a boy called Dennis, who I never spoke to because he is in Russia and he's still in Russia, who was totally brainwashed to become a propaganda masterpiece, saying Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is our president and he supports us. So yes, it works. Because children there who are taken to Russia, they are by themselves. They have no parents, no relatives close by to advise them. So they have to listen to some people around them, and people around them trying to sway their mind away.
We're now so focused on Israel-Hamas. Is that a worry to you that so much of the focus has moved away from thinking about Russia and Ukraine, and that therefore the international pressure, such as it was, on the Russians to deal with these children may have been lessened? Is that a worry to you?
It's a big worry, not only to me, but to everyone who supports Ukraine, because I look at the news agenda, and Ukraine got out of the headlines. In the meantime, while the whole world is busy with Hamas in Israel, Russia intensified its bombardment of Ukrainian cities. Every day, several Ukrainian cities are being bombarded and civilians are dying. Whether the attention is taken away from the children, no. No, the children is a huge category and something needs to be done, so therefore efforts are going on. But the fact that the war has intensified in Ukraine is the case.
Your program is called Ukraine's Stolen Children. It's on ITV.
It's on ITV.
When is the next show on ITV? I mean, obviously we can see it online as well.
It's on ITV Hub, so exactly. It's there.
And how many parts?
3 parts.
3 parts. Congratulations again on that. Many thanks indeed to Shahida Telegonova. Michael Heseltine has never been shy about wading into controversial subjects, be it Brexit or the environment. Now he has flown into another storm. He's confessed that when tasked with changing the map of Britain's local government bodies, he soared over the country in a light aircraft and redrew the boundaries on a map, a process that he cheerily admits would fail judicial review today. The 1972 Local Government Act introduced new administrative areas such as Metropolitan Merseyside, Greater Manchester and West Midlands, changes that still stick in the craw of many. Out went the Yorkshire Ridings, and in came entities such as Cumbria, an amalgamation of historic Cumberland, Westmoreland and part of Lancashire. A devoted band of campaigners remains determined to undo what they see as an act of cultural vandalism. I'm joined now by Henry Smith, the Conservative Member of Parliament. So, Henry, help me to understand why we should worry so much about boundaries that were changed, 50 years ago.
Well, I was born in 1969, so this happened when I suppose I was a toddler. But I think place and a sense of community is very important. And I'm very struck by the fact that people who live in long abolished historic counties like Middlesex, for example, still refer fondly to that county. This isn't a campaign about wanting to have massive local government reorganisation. This isn't about who delivers your local services, whether that's social care or schools or the police service or ambulances or anything like that. This is about making sure that we recognise the historic counties on an official level, align the historic counties with the Lord Lieutenancies, and make sure that there are things like boundary signs on major roads so that people can have that sense of place and community. Many of these counties, my own county, Sussex, is older than England, and it's important, I think, that we recognise and remember those counties as a legacy, but also for future identity as well.
So, Henry, your campaign is basically symbolic. I was brought up in Middlesex. I was educated under the Middlesex County Council Education Department. But, Henry, seriously, if you had been Michael Heseltine looking down on Greater Manchester, looking down on Merseyside, would you have said, oh, well, we need to just go on with old Lancashire? Or would you have said that, you know, since the historic counties were created, urbanisation had really changed reality and therefore it was time to change the map of local government?
Henry. I think what our campaign is saying isn't that it's about who delivers your services. Absolutely, it makes sense that there are Manchester-wide services, whether that be public transport or London, and that those should be taken as an entity for the delivery of local public services and democratic accountability. But I think what this is saying is that we should recognise the historic counties that have existed for many hundreds of years, give people a sense of place and identity. So really, this isn't about who delivers your public services, who empties your bins. This is about a sense of identity of where you live, a sense of place. And I pay tribute, for example, to the Ordnance Survey, who on their interactive maps do have a facility where you can see exactly where your historic county boundaries are. That's a good start, but I think there needs to be a slightly more official recognition. And as I say, our suggestion is the Lord Lieutenancies, so that the Crown's representative in the counties should reflect those traditional and historic counties.
I'm joined also by Gerard Dugdale, who is from the British Counties Campaign. Gerard, welcome to GB News. Is your position pretty similar to Henry Smith's? You feel that it's time to restore symbolism, basically?
I'm not so sure about the symbolic point. I think it's a bit beefier than that. I think we want to recognise the fact that lots of organisations still continue to use the traditional counties, and that's what we want to sort of reinforce. I mean, the government will give us sort of two statements, really. On the one hand, it says the counties were changed, yet on the other hand, it says that the counties were maintained. So which of those two do we want to pick on? If we say that the counties still persist, then we want that properly recognised by the powers that be, and in all the references that are made to these very historic geographical areas.
Gerard, can you conjure up in your mind, as I can, the picture of the young Michael Heseltine in his light aircraft travelling across Britain with an Ordnance Survey in his left hand and a pencil in his right hand, redrawing the boundaries of England? And if you can conjure that up in your mind, what is your reaction?
I can't at all. I think he's making it all up. And then the best case might be it would have been a helicopter, but I guess that's a bit of a cheap joke. But the thing is, we asked his office at the start of this campaign about 6 or 7 years ago, what was his involvement in what happened? And because we kept hearing the name Michael Heseltine. We got a reply from his office through Michael, who threw his hands in the air and said, nothing to do with me. I was merely a junior minister at the time, presumably in the Edward Heath cabinet. So I'm not quite sure where this sudden confession is coming from.
Well, Henry, you are a politician. Do you think Michael Heseltine has been a little bit mischievous here? Maybe Gerard's on a point that actually it's pretty hard to imagine that this is actually what he did. Is he just stirring things up? Is he just provoking people like you?
Well, as a Conservative, I prefer Portillo conservatism than I do to Heseltinian conservatism, I have to say, on a range of areas. He is obviously a figure who occasionally likes to stir things up, but I do think it is more serious than that. Of course, this was also a time when Britain was in negotiations to join what would become the European Union at the time, the Common Market. And one of the requirements of entry into the EEC, as it was then, was a regional approach to local government, because most of the then member states based their local government on a regional system. So I think we also saw this destruction of the historic counties in many cases because of the requirements of signing the Treaty of Rome and joining the common market. So it was a time of huge change, and the world continues to be a time of change. And I think in times of change, we need some constancy. And I think having those historic counties officially recognised, as I say, this isn't about what council delivers your services or what police authority or what health trust. This is about a sense of place where people live, history, but also going forward for the future as well.
It's very interesting that in the Conservative Party, the European shadow falls over everything. Many thanks indeed to Gerard Dugdale and Henry Smith MP. After the break, Stefan Kyriazis will be here to lament the passing of the unlikely theatre impresario Bill Kenwright, who at one time hired more actors than the BBC. Stay with us.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back. Stefan Kyriazis, the Lion of London theatre critics, joins me now. Steph and I believe you took no pride in the main show that you've been to this week, called Lyonesse.
I did indeed. Now, it's famously a mythical land off the coast off the west coast that sank beneath the waves. And it's very rare that critics agree. We're a fractious bunch, but most of us would agree the play should do the same because it just does not work. It doesn't work.
What goes wrong?
There's such an amazing pedigree, and it's, you know, hugely anticipated. Kristin Scott Thomas on stage, Lily James, film star, Ian Rickson is directing, who was at the Royal Court, and it's a powerful story about two parallel women's stories. An actress from 30 years ago that was stalked and bullied by her film director husband, partner, and then disappeared for 30 years. She's re-emerged now that he's died. And Lily James is a young film executive that's sent down to her crumbling old mysterious house to get the story out of her and to get a film made. Lily James, inexplicably, is a high-powered film executive because, as always, she's a little bit golden retriever, sort of ditzy and jolly and a bit hockey sticks and pretty ineffective, always apologising. But then it turns out she's also got a bit of a Me Too story, and we meet her very gaslighting, toxic husband, played by James Corrigan, who is superb.
So gaslighting and Me Tooism and a great cast, how can it fail?
Important themes, great cast, badly written, I'm sorry to say. Penelope Skinner, it's her first play in the West End. She's had a few at the at the Royal Court and on the South Bank. It makes no sense. The tone is all over the place. It starts a little ab-fab in the London film studios, film offices, and her boss, Dean McKigan, has got like a pink stripe in her hair and a pink blouse and neon signs. And I don't think these places exist like that outside ab-fab. And the tone lurches all over the place. So Kristin Scott Thomas, wonderful, appears first in a bathing cap, swimsuit and a fur coat and wellies because she has a daily swim. There's a huge cage of stuffed parrots, which becomes an increasingly clunky metaphor for caged birds and
caged women,
dead hopes and dreams and all this sort of thing. One of my fellow critics made a brilliant riff on the Monty Python Dead Parrot sketch, which I highly respect and I'm very jealous of. But the tone goes all over the place. So we get like mad moments of karaoke. And when Kristin Scott Thomas finally tells this awful story of what happens to her, she does it in a performative way on a stage made in her living room with a microphone and fairy lights and her poet lesbian best friend shining lamps on her. And she sort of recites it like it's a sort of dramatic monologue.
Very strange.
It's very strange. It doesn't work. It's hugely disappointing.
Where should we not see this?
That's on at the Harold Pinter Theatre until December the 23rd.
Now, you have seen, but you cannot yet review The Time Traveller's Wife.
Yes.
Explain why you can't do that.
That is still, it's doing lots of review shows, so I want to get in early, but the official embargo is Wednesday. So the final night of reviews is Wednesday, and then all the reviews will be out then. So I can tell you about it.
And can we see something from it?
I think we've got a little clip of Joss Stone, who wrote the music with Dave Stewart from the Eurythmics. She's singing one of the numbers.
Let's have a look at that.
Yeah, absolutely.
This time.
So that was Joss Stone, and you cannot review The Time Traveller's Wife.
I can tell you
But what can you do?
I can tell you about it. So basically based on Audrey Niffenegger's book about a girl that falls in love with a man that slips backwards and forwards in time. The book is, I read the book, you know what I'm like, crying. Read the book in St James's Park years ago on a sunny day surrounded by families and frisbees. Weeping in this park on my own, feeling like a complete fool. The story is beautiful. They made a film out of it that wasn't so great and a recent TV show. So the staging, they've got wonderful effects for when he appears and disappears in time all the time. I got a couple of gasps and applauses from the audience. Some lovely graphics. The music, as you can see, it's a little bit sort of Broadway jazz pop. And it's got it's got great actors, Joanne Woodward as Claire and David Hunter, who I love, as the disappearing Henry. So a lot of things going for this show.
Came painfully close to a review, I would say. Now, let us turn our attention to this extraordinary figure, Bill Kenwright.
Yes.
Not everyone will have heard of him, so do you mind, as it were, introducing him from the beginning?
Well, it's a bit of a sort of slip thing, so I can't help you with the football side because he was very involved in Everton. So he's a massive figure in Everton Football Club's history. But on the theatre side, he's an absolute giant. So across the years, as a producer, he produced over 500 shows, films and albums. Started out as an actor on Corrie in 1968 and left after a year to start exploring producing. And what he did, he's always understood popular entertainment. Get the people in, entertain them. Huge supporter of touring shows across the country. So this is a massive loss outside London as well. And from...
We've implied, of course, that he was very strongly connected to Liverpool. And he did other work for the arts in Liverpool, apart from what he did for football. So that would be part of the reason why he had this non-metropolitan focus, I think.
Absolutely. Well, he appeared on, I think, age 12 on stage at Liverpool Playhouse, was going to be an actor, went to school with the Beatles, with Harrison and McCartney. And in the 90s, he saved the Liverpool Playhouse from bankruptcy as well. So he's always been about supporting outside London. I think at one stage they said that apart from the BBC, he was the biggest employer of actors in the country. So massively huge figure, but also enthusiastic, passionate, loved what he did, fed us. Like most of the time we get wine, beer and soft drinks.
Oh, literally fed you?
At all the shows there'd always be a grand spread, which we appreciated, or a marvellous dinner on the banks of the Thames in Windsor. But all the way from, obviously, Billy Liar was his first show, I think in 1969, but Blood Brothers is the big one. That hadn't done terribly well, Willie Russell's play, when it first came out.
And he picked it up.
Picked it up, reinvigorated it, gave it some welly, and it ran in the West End for 24 years, toured the country. He toured the country with Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dream Show for 34 years, won awards on Broadway, massive figure, highbrow and lowbrow.
What happened with him in football was less happy. There was great falling out with the fans at Everton. But you and I don't know too much about that. So
no. we celebrate him.
Yeah, we celebrate him and we lament his passing.
Yeah.
So I was at the Royal Opera House last night. I went to see the ballet. I went to see Don Quixote.
Wonderful.
Now, I'm not as big a ballet fan as I am an opera fan, but I must say this was very, very persuasive. It is the liveliest, most colourful, loveliest show that you've seen. It's still running, so I recommend people to go along and see it. Last night, I saw two debutantes. It's basically not about Don Quixote. It's about a love affair. And the two debutantes last night, and it was absolutely fabulous. Stefan, thank you very much indeed. I hope you'll be back next week. Stefan Kyriazis, that's the end of the first hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo. However, the second coming is nigh. I shall return at 12 o'clock noon when I'll speak to this student who's retraced the steps of his great-grandfather, a downed RAF pilot who escaped occupied France by walking through the Pyrenees. Stay with us.
Hello, my name is Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So there's been plenty of unsettled weather around this weekend, and that's all due to this area of low pressure out to the west of the UK. This low out in the North Sea is bringing some slightly stronger winds across northern and southern coasts, but also this area of persistent rain across eastern Scotland and northeast England. Some heavy bursts within that as well as we go through the rest of Sunday. Elsewhere, it's a mixture of sunny spells and showers, and these could be frequent for southern and western coasts, heavy especially for southwest Wales and southeastern parts of England throughout this morning and as we go into this afternoon. Into this evening, that rain across Scotland and northern England will slowly ease away as that low pulls away to the east, but still some rain for a time as we go into the early hours of Monday. Showers becoming confined to coastal areas across the southwest, so a few clear spells around across Scotland and eastern England, so maybe the odd fog patch to start Monday, and maybe a touch of frost for some northwestern parts of Scotland. Elsewhere on Monday morning, it's another day of sunshine and showers, especially across the southern and western coasts. A band of showers making its way into Northern Ireland as we go through the morning, so expect some heavy and persistent rain there, but still feeling pretty pleasant in any sunny spells, especially away from the coast, with highs of 14 to 16.
We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the second hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo, a high noon of culture, travel, debate and world affairs. The environmental, social and governance investing standards have become an important guiding principle for investors determined that their money should not be put into allegedly tainted companies. How is that impact measured and defined? Isn't it enough for investors merely to remain within the law? Since the Confederation of British Industry claims that 2/3 of investors consider ESG guidelines before moving their money, we'll debate their value both to the market and to society. The defence and foreign policy of Australia might once have been considered a second-order question in world affairs, but not anymore, with the emergence of China as a major world power and the question of security in the Indo-Pacific region at the forefront of policymakers' minds. The stance of the government in Canberra is of great moment. I'll be joined in studio by Australia's Shadow Defence Secretary and a former captain in the SAS Regiment, Andrew Hastie. Also during this coming hour, a major new study by British scientists concludes that it's too late to save the West Antarctic ice sheet. meaning that major sea level rises in the next 2 centuries are an inevitability. What would that mean for our coastlines? I'll speak to an oceanographer at the University of Southampton. And having made a TV series, Walking in the Pyrenees, I was fascinated to read of a Welsh student who retraced the steps of his heroic great-grandfather through the same mountain range. Frank Griffiths was an RAF pilot shot down over occupied France who escaped via the Pyrenees into Spain with a lot of help from locals along the way. And 80 years on, his great-grandson will tell me how he was reacquainted with the family who sheltered Frank in the barn. All of that to come, but first, here's your news update with Tatiana Sanchez.
Michael, thank you and good afternoon. This is the latest. There are reports today of people in Gaza breaking into aid centres and warehouses in a desperate search for vital supplies. The United Nations described it as a worrying sign that civil order is starting to fade, with the ongoing conflict giving way to a humanitarian catastrophe. Despite assurances from Israel that aid trucks will be allowed in, the UN says supplies are insufficient. Last night, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the second stage of its war with Hamas has begun and warned of a long and difficult campaign ahead. The Gaza Health Ministry said this morning just over 8,000 people have been killed. A group of Israeli activists have held an anti-war demonstration in Tel Aviv. Protesters blocked a road near the Ministry of Defence, holding up banners claiming war has no winners. They also called for a ceasefire and the return of hostages. Prime Minister Netanyahu met some families of hostages yesterday, reassuring them their release is part of the country's military goals in Gaza. Now, as you've been hearing, the Hollywood actor Matthew Perry, star of the legendary sitcom Friends, has died at the age of 54.
Forget hypnosis. The way to quit smoking is you have to dance naked in a field of heather and then bathe in the sweat of 6 healthy young men.
Or what my father calls Thursday night.
Police were called to his home in Los Angeles, where he was found unresponsive in a hot tub. He became a household name as the dry and witty Chandler Bing, alongside Jennifer Aniston, Lisa Kudrow and others. The enormous success of Friends made it an icon of 90s popular culture. It ran for 10 seasons, and the final episode was the 5th most-watched finale in television history. Warner Brothers said in a statement that his comedic genius was felt around the world and his legacy will live on in the hearts of many. Showbiz expert Kinsey Schofield spoke to GB News about the sad news.
This is a man who we have seen working on his body and challenging his body over the last few weeks. One of the last paparazzi photos taken of Matthew was on October 3rd as he exited a gym. So I know that there is speculation in regards to his past and, you know, could some of those demons have come back to haunt him when it comes to addiction? But he, over the last year or so, I'd say 2 years now, was very proud of his sobriety, promoted his sobriety, and was focused on being better physically and mentally.
In other news, police are being encouraged to double their use of facial recognition software over the next 6 months to track down known offenders. Policing Minister Chris Philps says the technology could be used to scan more than 200,000 images, matching them against the police database. He's also encouraging officers to expand the use of live facial recognition so offenders might be identified on the spot. Mr Philps says it'll allow police to stay one step ahead of criminals and make Britain's streets safer. Meanwhile, the number of police who've been sacked for misconduct is up by 70%, with around 100 losing their jobs in the last 12 months. The Met Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, says the number's likely to increase as the force cracks down on those who are unfit to serve. A US tech entrepreneur says the NHS's backlog can't be solved without technological innovation. Alex Karp, the chief executive and co-founder of Plantier, which is bidding to win a contract to provide AI software to the health service. He says the use of AI in healthcare would speed up systems and improve life expectancy. It comes as NHS waiting lists are predicted to top 8 million by next summer. Scotland's Refugees Minister is asking the UK government for urgent funding to help communities house migrants. Emma Roddick supports the government's plan to cut the use of hotels for housing asylum seekers, and she says tackling a backlog in cases should be a priority. But she warns that shifting the financial burden onto local authorities would be unacceptable and reckless. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick said this week that the number of hotels used to house migrants will be cut by 50 over the next 3 months. And finally, in sport, there was controversy last night when heavyweight champion Tyson Fury recovered from being knocked down, winning a split decision against newcomer Francis Ngannou. The 37-year-old MMA fighter Ngannou put Fury on the canvas. After just the third round, he connected Fury with a left hook, but while one judge scored it in Ngannou's favour, two of the judges gave it to Fury. His victory means a bout with fellow heavyweight champion Alexander Usyk remains on the line. You're with GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio, and now on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you, Tatiana Sanchez. Since the 1990s, ESG, that's environmental, social and governance principles, have become a major consideration for companies and investors keen to ensure, or to appear to ensure, that companies' products benefit the world and are produced with respect for the environment and human rights. But according to an article in the Financial Times, born in sanctimony, nurtured with hypocrisy and sold with sophistry, ESG grew unchallenged for a decade, but is now facing a mountain of troubles, almost all of its own making, close quote, ouch. The accusation is that ESG has diverted management from running the business, and for many companies following ESG guidance diminishes returns. Is ESG really facing a mountain of troubles? I have two highly informed panellists. Matthew Lynn is a financial columnist at the Daily Telegraph, and Simon Perham is Head of Investor Outreach at Carbon Tracker. Welcome both to GB News. Simon, what do you make of that assessment? Is ESG facing a mountain of troubles?
I think the reality is that ESG investing, the point is the investing bit, and that when you look at ESG, you've got the physical asset or the person, etc. And then you've got the financial proxy that represents it. And in many respects, the two are connected, but in many respects, the two are not connected. That the financial proxy has its own set of priorities and its own set of drivers. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that we don't mix the two. And with every proxy, it goes up and down with time. You can pick your own time period, and it can tell you ESG has done well, or it can tell you that ESG investing has done badly.
Talking there about stock market value.
Yes.
Because as I understand it, I mean, you're, as it were, in this business. But over time, you moved from saying simply, we ought to do ESG because it's the right thing to do for the planet and for people. And you went further and said, we ought to do ESG because it's going to raise the share value of the companies. That article I quoted in the FT says that is self-evidently not the case. There will be niche companies that will benefit in that way. But companies doing, as it were, regular business, if they take extra measures to care for the environment, extra measures to care for human rights or whatever, the likelihood is that it's going to impact their bottom line negatively. Do you dispute that?
Well, I think, Michael, if we were just talking about this earlier, when you look at the balance sheet of a company, and when you look at the P&L of a company, and when you look at the cash flow of a company, effectively each one of those is a measure of human endeavour. Mm-hmm. And if you don't look after the humans, you are going to find that they don't work as proficiently as perhaps they could do. You don't get the maximum out of that. So I think it's very real that you should at least in investing, because you're looking after not only the returns but the value of what you've got already, that you should take those into account.
Matthew Lynn, where do you stand on this? Maybe you don't agree with the Financial Times assessment that ESG is facing a mountain of problems, but you're quite worried about some of the things that we're being steered away from investing in.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, the first thing to say is, when you say, there should be ethical, companies should behave ethically, well, no one's going to disagree with that. No one wants companies to behave unethically, and not just to stick within the law. Obviously, there's the law, but obviously they should do a little bit more than that. They should just try and be good corporate citizens. So everyone's kind of signed up to that. I think the problem with ESG, I think there were two problems with it, really. One is it kind of led to a politicization of corporate life, which I think was a mistake and was damaging. And we saw that, for example, with NatWest debanking Nigel Farage, with some of the ridiculous statements that Ben & Jerry's was making on the Israel-Palestine conflict, which, as we've been discovering in the last week, is a very complex issue. An ice cream manufacturer doesn't really have anything useful to contribute to that. So I think it became over-politicized, and companies should be, big corporations should be roughly politically neutral. I think the second big problem, and we've seen this a lot in the last 2 or 3 years, I think, and actually Unilever came out and said that the new chief executive of Unilever came out and said this week, that it was a distraction, that actually they put so much emphasis on kind of social purpose for brands and for products that they forgot about the real purpose, which is creating new products, making some money for their shareholders.
Making a good ice cream.
Making a good ice cream, I mean, the previous chief executive of Unilever said that, it wasn't good enough just to make your clothes whiter and your food tastier. And actually the new guys, and I think that was part of the reason he lost his job, because the returns were dismal. And the new guy who came in this week was saying, actually that is good enough. And that's harder than it looks, and that's plenty. And if we could just do a good job doing that, that's fine.
And I was saying to Simon earlier that, this progressed to the point where they were telling companies, if you invest in this way and if you operate in this way, it's going to improve your share value. The NatWest example is a hideous example of the opposite, isn't it? I mean, the Farage thing has been a bit of a catastrophe for NatWest. The share price now in, adjusted terms is back where it was in February 2009. And the company looks in a mess. So, I mean, has this been a bit of a wake-up call? Are companies seeing that there's a downside risk as well as an upside benefit?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, and it comes back to my point about distraction. I mean, Alison Rose at NatWest, I'm gonna have to look up her salary, but it was huge. It was millions a year, and she was winning lots of awards for kind of, for all the kind of ESG metrics, and the company was not in a good state. I mean, the company's share price is even worse than it was in the financial crisis. And there were lots of things that NatWest should have been doing better, but it became a distraction, and not just a distraction. I think there was definitely an atmosphere in the city where, as long as you could tick the ESG boxes, it was all fine. And you didn't actually, not just the share price, but actually growing the company, creating new jobs, creating new products, investing in the branch network, all the things that are important and lead to a higher share price ultimately.
Simon, do you want to fight back? Because we're manufacturing an assumption here now that management distraction has led some companies into great difficulty. Do you want to fight back against that proposition?
No, I don't. I think it's perfectly reasonable to actually say that. Michael, you've got to remember that markets always have a consumer at the end of it, and that the job of a company is to produce a product that the consumer wants. And consumers have an uncomfortable habit of changing their mind what they want willy-nilly. And so, for example, the cost of living is now on most people's minds, whereas previously ESG was on most people's minds. But equally, the company has to balance those acts that not only look at what their customers want, but protect their stakeholder chain all the way through. And that's not just the investor, it's all the way through. The employees, the supply chain, they're people.
Yeah.
And I think companies have to look after, and investors have to realise that investing is not all about returns, but it's also about keeping the engine that is producing this value in the right frame of mind.
I feel this has been a good moment to have this discussion, and time will tell whether at the high watermark of ESG. It would be interesting perhaps to get together in a year's time and see how we feel about it then. But thank you very much to Simon Perham and Matthew Lynn. After the break, I'll be speaking to the Shadow Defence Minister of Australia about how his party would position his country in the Indo-Pacific region, a question of increasing significance now to NATO. Stay with us.
Good afternoon, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So as we go through the rest of Sunday, plenty of rain still around, and that's all due to this area of low pressure out to the west of the UK. It's this low in the North Sea that's been bringing rain across Scotland and northern parts of England throughout today, and that will continue for a time as we go through this evening, but slowly pulling away to the east as the low moves away. Elsewhere, it'll be a mixture of clear spells and showers around through tonight, but then becoming increasingly confined to southern and western coast to allow for some clear spells in the east and across northern parts of Scotland. So we could see the odd patch of fog tonight and maybe a touch of frost across northwestern parts of Scotland to start Monday. It's another day of sunshine and showers for many as we go through Monday, with showers most frequent once again across southern and western coasts. A bit more in the way of sunshine though across the south of England than we've seen over the weekend, but a persistent band of showers feeding into Northern Ireland throughout the day on Monday, so some heavy bursts of rain especially for the southeast there, though still feeling pretty pleasant in the sunshine as we go through Monday. Tuesday though, as we've got winds now coming from a bit of a northerly direction across the northern parts of the UK, a cool start here, some fog around elsewhere, as well as further showers across the south, and that unsettled theme is continuing throughout the week with some cooler conditions in the north and further bands of rain to come.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's
my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back. As the question of security in the Indo-Pacific region has risen near to the top priorities list for Western capitals, so too has the strategic significance of Australia. Canberra executed a major diplomatic initiative just over 2 years ago when it signed up to the AUKUS Pact with Britain and the United States. That deal, under which Australia will acquire nuclear-propelled submarines, is widely believed to have been made with China in mind. The Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has been received with a presidential banquet in Washington, and he will visit Beijing next month, the first such trip by an Australian Premier since 2016. I'm very pleased now to be joined by the man determined to take charge of the important defence brief. Andrew Hastie is a former captain in the Australian Army's SAS regiment who completed 3 tours of Afghanistan and is now the Shadow Defence Minister of Australia. And he's in London for the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship event, which takes place tomorrow. Welcome to GB News. You've just got off a plane. Thank you very much for being with us. I'll make that point very clear.
I'm delighted to be here.
Well, that's great of you. How happy are you with your government's position on China?
Well, look, I think it's really important for policymakers to recognise the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. Over the last 10 years, China has racked up a huge trust deficit, not just in our region, but across the globe. And I think for policymakers here in the UK and Australia, the single biggest foreign policy challenge in the next decade and beyond is China and how we deal with it. And so my argument for the last 5 or 6 years is that Australia has to assert its sovereignty, its digital sovereignty through the 5G program that we're rolling out. We excluded Huawei. We advocated for the UK to do the same. We've got to protect critical infrastructure like ports. You might have seen a decision around the Port of Darwin over the last week or so where the Albanese government chose not to divest a Chinese business of the lease that they entered into.
Your party would?
Our party was certainly going to review it, and we'd be very tough about it. There's a geopolitical structural challenge, and that is that there is increasing competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We're a small middle power, and we have a deep relationship with the United States and now the UK as well through AUKUS. China, of course, is revisionist. It wants to upend the global rules-based order. It's also expansionist, and we see that through militarisation of the South China Sea, through the islands there. We see it through their economic aims, through the Belt Road Initiative. I think we really need to be clear-eyed about China, its long-term aims, and essentially the challenge it poses to free peoples.
If you want to be clear-eyed about China, does it help to go to Beijing and meet the leadership? Does that help you to see clearly?
Well, my view is you should always talk to everyone.
So no controversy about that. You don't object to Mr Albanese going to Beijing?
Of course not. And it's good that he's maintaining a relationship with China. You've got to remember that it was China who froze out our Prime Minister and the coalition government over the last 5 or 6 years. So a restoration of relations is a good thing, but we have to be clear-eyed about it. Of course, our Prime Minister is in the United States with President Biden, and President Biden and his officials have warned us about the challenge of China. And so we need to make sure that we uphold our sovereignty, that we make very clear our position of disagreement with China, but also we have a strong and deep trade relationship with China, and that's why it's a bit of a paradox.
Yeah. What conversation should Mr Albanese have in Beijing, do you think?
Well, we've had a number of Australians detained for some time by China. We had an Australian journalist, Ching Lei, released just recently. There's another gentleman who's being held. We should fight for those people. We should make very clear that we are unhappy with that situation.
And at a more strategic level, what would the conversation be?
Well, I think like Rishi Sunak did, making it very clear that espionage and foreign interference is something that we take very seriously. In 2018, we introduced landmark laws to defend Australia's sovereignty from increased espionage and foreign interference. So I think that needs to be an ongoing part of the conversation, because as our security chiefs have warned us, espionage and foreign interference in Australia is at unprecedented levels, exceeding that of the Cold War.
There's a certain theory running around that with the world so distracted by two major wars, and with the United States running up to a presidential election with the two candidates that there are likely to be, that this could be a moment for China to act over Taiwan. Do you share that fear?
I do share that fear. I think President Xi has made it very clear that reunification with Taiwan is his strategic aim, and we need to be prepared to impose cost if such action is taken.
What cost?
Well, that'll be decided by the governments of the day. But this is deterrence theory. We can't afford to have.
But deterrence doesn't work if the party taking the action doesn't know what the cost is.
Well, and this is the challenge for policymakers like me, for the Australian government, for the UK government, anyone who wants to uphold free peoples like the Taiwanese.
Do you think if you were in office, you would like to define what the cost would be to China so that they would understand the deterrence?
I think what we're doing through AUKUS is lifting our own military capability. I think we'll have a greater presence in the region, which will contribute to collective security in our region, and that's very, very important. That's why the US and the UK are such important partners in the Indo-Pacific. I know the UK has a lot to focus on with Russia and Ukraine and Europe generally, but it's really important that we have policymakers, people like Tom Tugendhat, who's been very solid on China, are focused on the Indo-Pacific region. And Michael, it was great to have Johnny Mercer out to Perth very recently. And again, just seeing UK policymakers come out, see the geography for themselves and understand the challenges that we face as a country.
Yeah, I entirely sympathise with that point. I mean, it may seem very odd, but just by being on a different spot on the globe, we begin to see things from a different perspective. You mentioned Ukraine in passing there. Are you satisfied with the amount of support that is being given by the Australian government to the Ukrainians?
I think we can do more. I think if you look at Ukraine, in a sense, that's a Western front. If you look at Taiwan, that's an Eastern front. And it's really, really important that Russia has a great cost imposed on them for this unilateral, unprovoked, unjust war against the Ukrainian people, because it sends a message to other authoritarian powers who might take on military adventures of their own.
I mean, I talked about fears. There is obviously a very widespread fear now that the focus of the West, if I can call it that, on Israel versus Hamas is taking away focus from Ukraine, Russia. Not only focus, actually, but support. I mean, weaponry, shells that may have been destined for Ukraine may now be diverted. Do you share that worry?
I do. I think free countries like Australia, the United Kingdom, the US, we need to start investing more in our military munitions. I think it's really important, particularly as they get run down supporting the war in Ukraine. And of course, the attacks, the brutal attacks by Hamas on the Israeli people just remind us that the barbarians are back, and we need to be prepared to defend ourselves.
I mean, it would be a sorry state of affairs, wouldn't it, if the West, as we run up to the presidential election in the United States, ends up by putting some sort of pressure on Zelensky to reach a settlement, which obviously would mean Russia on Ukrainian territory.
That's right. It should be totally unsatisfactory. So
that doesn't necessarily mean it won't happen. May I ask you about the voice referendum that was held in Australia? A couple of weeks ago, Tim Smith was sitting where you were, and he gave us a view. What's it done to Australian politics? How do you stand now?
Well, I think the no vote, which was about 60%, was a huge rebuke to the elites in Australia.
Right.
This was a referendum that was driven from the top down. I was on the no side. My seat recorded the highest no vote in Western Australia. I had 76.5 of my constituency vote no. It's a working class seat, a bit like the red wall seats here in the UK. A massive rebuke to the elites. They had the support of big tech with favourable algorithms for yes. They had big finance, the banks on their side. They had big sport, all the major sporting codes supporting it. They had big business. They had big unions. It was the big guy versus the little guy. In fact, if you look at the money, the No campaign spent about $15.5 million. The Yes campaign had more than $50 million. And still, the Australian people have had enough of identity politics. They've had enough of being divided. And The people I spoke to who voted no were voting for a unified Australia, where race and ancestry doesn't matter. We're all equal before the law.
It's quite funny because you expect people in politics to learn lessons. You know, I was in favour of Brexit, and I wasn't all that hopeful during the referendum campaign. But my hopes got up when I saw this coalition of forces, the sort that you've described, and here it was also the banks. I mean, the banks, for heaven's sake, after the banking rush, the banks were telling us that we ought to remain in the European Union. And I think the little guy said here, well, if all those people are lined up and think that we should remain in the European Union, I want to do the opposite. So maybe you had a similar effect.
Yeah, and I'm hoping they're chastened by this, because they'll send their government relations people to Parliament and start lobbying for favourable policies, and they might get a cold shoulder for some time.
Andrew Hastie, I think you better get some sleep at some point, but you've been absolutely sharp as a razor on this show. Shadow Defence Minister in Australia, just got off a plane. In a few minutes, I'll be asking what Britain's coastline might look like in 200 years' time, as scientists from the United Kingdom say that it's now impossible to stop the melting of the massive West Antarctic ice sheet. Before that, here's a quick news update with Tatiana Sanchez.
Michael, thank you very much. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. Communications are slowly being restored in Gaza after a blackout severely impacted yesterday's rescue efforts. Israeli forces are expanding ground operations in Gaza, but the United Nations warns that civil order is starting to fade, with reports of people breaking into aid centres and warehouses in a desperate search for vital supplies. Despite assurances that aid trucks will be allowed in, the UN says supplies are insufficient. Last night, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the second stage of war with Hamas has begun. The Gaza Health Ministry said this morning just over 8,000 people have died. The Hollywood actor Matthew Perry, star of the legendary sitcom Friends, has died at the age of 54.
Forget hypnosis. The way to quit smoking is you have to dance naked in a field of heather and then bathe in the sweat of 6 healthy young men.
Or what my father calls Thursday night.
Police were called to his home in Los Angeles, where he was found unresponsive in a hot tub. He became a household name as the dry and witty Chandler Bing, alongside Jennifer Aniston, Lisa Kudrow and others. The enormous success of Friends made it an icon of 90s popular culture. It ran for 10 seasons, and the final episode was the 5th most watched finale in TV history. Warner Brothers said in a statement his comedic genius was felt around the world, and his legacy will live on in the hearts of many. Police are being encouraged to double their use of facial recognition software over the next 6 months to track down known offenders. Policing Minister Chris Philps says the technology could be used to scan more than 200,000 images, matching them against the police database. He's also encouraging officers to expand the use of live facial recognition so offenders might be identified on the spot. Mr. Philps says it'll allow police to stay one step ahead of criminals and make Britain's streets safer. And a US tech entrepreneur says the NHS's backlog cannot be resolved without technological innovation. Alex Karp's the chief executive and co-founder of Plantir, which is bidding to win a contract to provide AI software to the health service. He says the use of AI in healthcare would speed up systems and improve life expectancy. It comes as NHS waiting lists are predicted to top 8 million by next summer. For more on all of those stories, you can visit our website, gbnews.com. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you very much, Tatiana Sanchez. Off the coast of southern Turkey, divers can explore the ruins of long-forgotten cities which were overcome by the oceans thousands of years ago, some of which may have inspired the legend of Atlantis. I mention that to imagine how future generations might have to view today's coastal towns and cities should sea levels rise. UK scientists have published a major new study suggesting that the melting of the massive West Antarctic ice sheet can no longer be stopped, meaning that sea level rises of roughly 5 metres are inevitable. To discuss those findings, I'm joined by Alberto Garabato. He's the Professor of Physical Oceanography at the University of Southampton. Professor Alberto Garabato, welcome to GB News. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Can I just begin? Some people think that there's been some catastrophizing about predictions about global warming. I believe that this is a single study. Can you, reassure us that this is kind of mainstream, that it's not being overly alarmist?
Well, yeah, I can certainly reassure you that that study is not an isolated freak prediction by scientists. This just adds to a body of evidence that now makes up many studies suggesting that regardless of what we do, we can probably not stop the melting of part of Antarctica, the West Antarctic ice sheet. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything about it, that we should just give up, because depending on what we choose to do in coming years and decades in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases, this will strongly affect the pace at which Antarctica melts.
So let's just be clear what we're talking about. Antarctica is a continent. It's made up of an enormous landmass. But reaching out from the sides of it, there are ice sheets, and one of these is on the west, and that's the thing that we're talking about. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. So Antarctica, the Antarctic ice sheet, which is this several kilometer thick layer of ice on top of the Antarctic continent, is made up of two parts. One is the West Antarctic ice sheet, the other one is the East Antarctic ice sheet. This study and many others suggest that the West Antarctic ice sheet is, we are committed to melting it over coming centuries, and it's just a question of how fast rather than of when, it's a question of when rather than of if. Now, the East Antarctic ice sheet, which is the other part of the Antarctic ice sheet, is a lot bigger than the West part. So it holds about 10 times as much sea level, and that one can still be saved as far as we know. So this also comes into, should come into our mind when we try and decide what course of action to take in coming years.
Where does this figure of a sea rise of 5 meters come from? Is this something that will occur globally? Is it not just the effect of what's happening to the West Antarctic ice sheet? Presumably it's the accumulation of what's happening to various phenomena, including the warming of the ocean, which would make the molecules move apart and make the sea, as it were, bigger, expand.
Yes, so that figure of 5 meters refers to how much water is held in the West Antarctic ice sheet. So if we melted all of it, global sea level everywhere around the world would go up by about 5 meters. So on top of that, we have other things going on, as you just mentioned. We have the expansion of the seawater of the ocean as it warms up, very much as when you put a pan with water on the hob and you forget about it and it overflows. That's what the ocean is doing now. It's warming up and it's expanding. And we have also the melting of another ice sheet in Greenland and also land glaciers. So the 5 meters is just for West Antarctica. Now, we shouldn't go and panic. This will happen probably slowly. It will happen over a few centuries. But I think what this means is that we should start thinking about how we plan our coastal towns, our coastal communities. We should stop building houses in places that are within 1 or 2 meters of sea level rise. We should start thinking about this so that we don't have to fix the problem in a rush when sea level is coming lapping out on doors.
A very interesting point of view. We tend to think of climate change as catastrophic. I just wonder whether it necessarily is. I mean, obviously we have gone through many changes on our planet before. I think about 5.3 million years ago, for example, the Mediterranean Sea was created. I mean, that was land, and suddenly the water burst through what we now think of as the Straits of Gibraltar and created the Mediterranean Sea. Now, we don't think of that as a climate disaster. So are rising water levels catastrophic?
It's a very good question. I think any of these events would only be catastrophic potentially from the point of view of humans. For the planet, all all of these changes are fine. The planet has been through warmer climates before, colder climates. There are all sorts of factors that have changed the climate of the planet, and ecosystems have recovered over millions of years. But in the time that we've been existing as humans in a civilization, say the last 10,000 years, nothing of this size has happened. So a sea level rise of a few meters, just to put it in context, would likely displace hundreds of millions, if not perhaps a billion people who actually live in the coast. And where would those people go? We'd have a massive refugee crisis, competition for land and space. So I think this kind of event, even though it will unfold slowly, could be comparable to a major international conflict. So I think we should take it seriously.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of view as well, because, of course, a lot of our discussions globally are about how to prevent climate change. At least part of what we do, I suppose, is that we have to plan for how we handle the climate change which is already in the pipeline.
That's correct. So a sea level rise of a few meters, if we're looking at it from the point of view of the UK, a country that is rich and capable and has a lot of resources, we can probably manage that. I think this would mean that there are low-lying parts of the UK where we would have to displace population, maybe relocate entire towns. It would be a major disruptor. It would be a big hit to the economy, but we would probably be able to manage a few meters of sea level rise if they happen slowly enough. Now, if we're talking about melting East Antarctica with tens of meters of sea level rise happening over centuries, yeah, I'm not sure how you manage that. I think we are talking about redrawing the map of not just the UK, but the world. And we are doing so slowly, but surely. And it's up to us and to our choices in coming years as to how much we redraw the map. We like to keep it as similar to today's as possible.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Professor Alberto Garabato. From the ocean floor to the mountain tops. After the break, I'll be speaking to a Welshman who, like me, has crossed the Pyrenees, recapturing family history.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back. In 2022, I filmed in the Pyrenees along the Spanish-French border for a television series. I recall that in 1939, my father Luis left Barcelona at the end of the Spanish Civil War and crossed those mountains to avoid capture. I'm joined now by a man who's been to the same majestic mountain range, also in the footprints of an ancestor. Adam Hart is the great-grandson of RAF pilot Frank Griffiths, who was shot down over occupied France in 1943 and escaped through the Pyrenees in the opposite direction to my father, from France into Spain, which was neutral, even though sympathetic to the Axis powers. It's exactly 80 years since Frank crossed the border into Spain. Adam, welcome to GB News.
Thank you very much for having me.
Tell me, how long have you known about this story? Has it always been circulating within the family?
Pretty much since birth, yeah. It's always been a family tale told at many lunches and dinners and things like that. So it's always been family folklore, but it's always sort of been slightly different depending on who tells it, and the characters vary a little bit and the details will vary a little bit. So really going to the Pyrenees and doing this whole retracing was partly to find out just exactly what happened.
Your great-grandfather was brought down, I think, near Annecy in France. Now, that's not particularly near the Pyrenees. So what was the connection between being downed in one place and then making this journey over the Pyrenees?
Yes, exactly. So he was shot down near Annecy in southeast France. His crew were all killed, 5 civilians, 2. It was a complete miracle he survived. He had terrible injuries coming away from the crash, really should have died. And he was taken in by the French resistance, who deemed that he wasn't fit enough to take the Pyrenees route to Gibraltar to get back to Britain. So the original plan was to get him to Switzerland and then to get him to northern France and then to be picked up by Lysander and go back to England that way. What happened was the plan all fell apart. Basically, the Gestapo were in town and all the resistance contacts went to ground. So he ended up being taken in by a new resistance network, and they operated in the Pyrenees. So they couriered him down to the Pyrenees, and he had to trek over the mountains instead.
Had he had time to recover from his injuries? Because he actually crossed the Pyrenees in, I think, just about 3 days. So he was having to do a lot of miles every day, wasn't he?
Yeah, incredible distances, really. I think they did 80 miles over 3 nights. But he hadn't really recovered. He'd spent a month in Switzerland recovering, but his shoulder was broken. He had a broken wrist, whiplash, massive head trauma. You know, he was still scarred in the face visually. And, you know, he was 31, still recovering, really. So it was absolutely brutal trek for him. I mean, when myself and my uncle retraced it, we tried to do it as faithfully as possible, and we had to take an extra day because we just couldn't keep up with the pace they were setting. And they were doing it at nighttime with the fear of capture. So it really was an incredible trek for him to have to do. And I mean, just for some details on the trek, just how brutal it was. I mean, at one point, Frank twisted his knee in a river crossing, and on the other side, on the other side, he decided to take his fatigue tablets, which were basically a form of meth. So you have this 31-year-old pilot trekking through the Pyrenean Mountains in the middle of the night with some complete strangers hallucinating on meth with a dodgy knee and a 19-year-old American airman who happened to be escaping with him at the same time. So it's just that's just one crazy detail from a totally crazy story.
We're seeing some photographs there of your expedition. You had a wonderful encounter with descendants of the people who looked after your great-grandfather.
Yes, I did. So the Sake family, who are Pyrenean farmers, they took in Frank on his first night in the Pyrenees. And after walking sort of 30 miles with him from Perpignan, and two of the boys, 14-year-old boys at the time who were guiding him, they wanted an English lesson in the daytime. So Frank gave them one while they were hiding and waiting for darkness to set off on the second night. And at the end of this lesson, Frank gave the boy his French-English pocket dictionary. And it said Frank Griffiths, Englishman, in the front. And obviously they didn't know each other's names or anything. After the war, Frank wanted to find these people to thank them, but he didn't know their names. Eventually, 30 years after the war, the Sake family happened to see Griffiths in the front cover, got in touch with the RAF Escaping Society and managed to find him. He went back out and said thank you 30 years later. And then 30 years after that, I went out with my uncle and basically did the same thing. And they still have the dictionary. It's still one of their most treasured possessions. And it's a really spine-tingling moment just to be presented it. Really an artifact that takes you straight back to that moment.
That is absolutely fantastic. And they gave you a slap-up lunch as well. This must have been quite an emotional meeting, I think.
It was incredibly, yeah. I mean, there's such, this happened 80 years ago, but there's such a strong, palpable link between our families, really. I mean, they were risking everything to save my great-grandfather, who just happened to be a British man escaping through the Pyrenees. They didn't have to do any of this. And the consequences were death, essentially. Death, torture, deportation, a really, really grim outcome if they were caught doing this. So, and everybody around that lunch table knew that when we were there 80 years later. And there was a moment where our host just toasted to Frank and toasted to her ancestors. And there weren't many dry eyes around the table. The wine had been flowing and it was a sunny, beautiful day, but it was a really beautiful moment. And yeah, just to think about what they had done for our family, it was incredible.
Adam Hart, that is a beautiful story, and may I congratulate you on making that expedition. And you and I are wearing our poppies today with this very much in mind. I mean, it actually brings the suffering and the sacrifice of the war years into our memories. Thank you so much for being with us on GB News. Well, in a few minutes, I'll be giving way to Emily Carver with enormous pleasure. What have you got for us?
Fascinating story, that.
Marvellous story.
Yeah, marvellous story. Excellent guest to have on. We're going to be, of course, looking at the very latest from Israel, Gaza. We've got Mark White on at the top of the show to tell us what's happened overnight. We know there was a communications blackout. That seems to be easing, but Israel's bombardment certainly isn't. They've hit many more hundreds of Hamas targets in the last couple of days. So we're getting the very latest, but also what's happening here in Britain. We saw, again, more protests in London and across the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, we saw a couple of statues at least being defaced by protesters. So we'll be discussing that because I worry, and I wonder what you think about this too. I worry that this conflict is exposing very deep divisions in our society in Britain today. And where do we go from here? How do we even begin to heal those?
I very much share your worry, and I think it's a responsibility for all of us, broadcasters, for example, not to intensify those divisions, to make sure that we speak with absolutely the right tone. Emily, we'll look forward to your show. I want to thank everyone for watching today and all my guests. It's been a great pleasure to host those guests today. I will be back next week, and I say to those of you who are able to, who are in a position to do so, have a peaceful Sunday.
Good afternoon, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So as we go through the rest of Sunday, plenty of rain still around, and that's all due to this area of low pressure out to the west of the UK. It's this low in the North Sea that's been bringing rain across Scotland and northern parts of England throughout today, and that will continue for a time as we go through this evening, but slowly pulling away to the east as the low moves away. Elsewhere, there'll be a mixture of clear spells and showers around through tonight, but then becoming increasingly confined to southern and western coast to allow for some clear spells in the east and across northern parts of Scotland. So we could see the odd patch of fog tonight and maybe a touch of frost across northwestern parts of Scotland to start Monday. It's another day of sunshine and showers for many as we go through Monday, with showers most frequent once again across the southern and western coasts. A bit more in the way of sunshine there across the south of England than we've seen over the weekend, but a persistent band of showers feeding into Northern Ireland throughout the day on Monday, so some heavy bursts of rain, especially for the southeast there. They're still feeling pretty pleasant in the sunshine as we go through Monday. Tuesday, though, as we've got winds now coming from a bit of a northerly direction across the northern parts of the UK, a cool start here, some fog around elsewhere, as well as further showers across the south. And that unsettled theme is continuing throughout the week, with some cooler conditions in the north and further bands of rain to come.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
You?
It's my new